Chapter 1. The Girl in the Ruins. The war on Kepra 9 had long since stopped making sense to the men and women ordered to fight it. Officially, it remained a stabilization campaign, a term polished enough to survive political briefings and news broadcasts back on Earth. But out on the ash-gray plains and shattered colony belts where the real work happened, everyone knew the truth had rotted far past its public name. Kepra 9 was a frontier world at the edge of 3 competing claims, rich in subterranean energy seams and poor in everything else that normally makes life easy. Before the war, it had been home to scattered mining cities, cliffside habitat towers, and wandering settlements of the native Illyarian elegant, long-lived species whose bodies had evolved beneath the planet's unstable magnetosphere and constant electrical storms. Then came the corporations, the private fleets, the treaty breakdowns, the insurgencies, the retaliations, and finally the arrival of regular military forces from powers that told themselves they were restoring order while spending every week teaching the world new shapes of grief. Sergeant Daniel Mercer had stopped trying to decide who had started it first. By his 3rd deployment, he had learned that on dead worlds, history often became less about origins and more about who was still carrying enough ammunition to keep lying about their reasons. Daniel was not a great hero by the standards of recruitment posters or military dramas. He was 32, broad-shouldered, prematurely tired around the eyes, and competent in the way armies actually survive on the ground. Not by speeches, but by remembering batteries, water discipline, triage routes, and the exact pressure needed to keep scared younger soldiers from either freezing or becoming stupidly brave. His unit, 7th Recon Infantry, had been sent into the western fracture belts after orbital scans suggested an abandoned insurgent relay station might still be transmitting target data to surviving militia cells. The job sounded straightforward in command language. Sweep the ruins. Check the subterranean levels. Recover any useful hardware. Leave nothing active behind. Straightforward jobs on Kepra 9 had a habit of turning into body retrievals before noon. But that morning the weather was clear by local standards, and the storm front 2 ridges north, so even Daniel let himself believe they might finish before dark. The relay station sat inside the skeleton of an old Illyari shrine city, half collapsed by bombardment and scavenger cutting. Ancient basalt spires rose broken against a copper sky, their smooth surfaces split by impact cracks and fungal rust, while newer human prefab structures clung to the lower terraces like cheap metal parasites feeding on a dead saint. Daniel's squad moved carefully through the debris fields, boots crunching glassy soil, rifle barrels tracking every window slit and ventilation seam. The first 2 levels were empty except for spent casings, old ration wrappers, and the kind of silence that usually means everyone has either fled or died recently enough to leave the place feeling watched. By the time they reached the relay chamber itself, their tech specialist had already confirmed the main core had been dead for at least 3 weeks. Lieutenant Haynes, young enough still to be irritated by unproductive danger, muttered a curse and began talking about exfil. That was when the sound came. At first Daniel thought it was wiring. A thin, irregular clicking from somewhere behind the shattered altar wall, too soft to be machinery and too rhythmic to be settling debris. He held up a fist, and the squad froze instantly. The clicking stopped. Then came a second sound, small, sharp, desperate, like someone trying very hard not to cry and failing in pieces. Haynes signaled left flank sweep, but Daniel was already moving, stepping over fallen stone and blackened devotional metal toward the rear cavity where the old wall had collapsed into a pocket beneath the floor. He expected a wounded scout, maybe an insurgent runner too young and too stubborn to die quietly. Instead, he found a child. She could not have been more than 6 or 7 by human developmental guess, though Illyari ages were never easy to read. She was curled into the farthest corner of the cavity under a bent ceremonial screen, all long narrow limbs and storm-pale skin mottled with dust and dried blood. Her silver-white hair clung in filthy cords around a face too small for the terror in it. Huge dark eyes flashed at him, ringed faintly with the bioluminescent blue that Illyari children developed under stress, making her look half ghost and half animal in the ruined dark. One arm was wrapped around a broken anchor stone, the kind of carved personal relic Illyari families used in their old faith practices to symbolize home, kin, and memory. The other arm bled from a shrapnel cut that had clotted badly and reopened every time she shook. When she saw the human uniform, she made a sound so raw and immediate that the entire ruined chamber seemed to recoil from it. Every gun in the squad came up. It was reflex, not cruelty, but reflex is how cruelty often enters the room. Shizuliari, one of the younger privates, said unnecessarily over comms, as if the species label itself were a warning. Lieutenant Haynes moved beside Daniel and stiffened. The order forming in the air was obvious before he voiced it. Native miner. Unidentified survival in active search zone. Potential tracker, decoy, or biotagged insurgent asset. Standard doctrine required detention pending intelligence screening if transport was practical, and if transport was not practical, then command discretion. On Kepra 9, command discretion had buried more shame than strategy ever had. Daniel looked at the child, at the blood crusting her arm, at the way she clutched the broken anchor stone like it was the last law in the universe still holding, and knew exactly what the lieutenant was about to choose. He also knew the squad was watching him, because everyone in field units learns very quickly which senior NCOs are still human in the old inconvenient sense, and which have traded that for smoother service records. Haynes keyed his mic. Ops, this is Echo 7 Actual. We have one live native juvenile in compromised structure dash. She's injured, Daniel cut in. Haynes turned slowly. I'm aware. She needs medical evac. Haynes's expression tightened in that dangerous way officers get when the enlisted remind them they are being observed morally instead of simply obeyed. Sergeant, we are not running a rescue operation for every hostile stray we find in the ruins. Daniel looked back at the child. She had stopped screaming now, maybe because exhaustion had outrun panic, maybe because she had decided the ending had already come and there was no more use in sound. Her glowing eyes stayed fixed on him, not trusting, not pleading, just measuring whether the face in front of her belonged to the kind of death she had already seen before. He had seen those eyes in other wars: 2 human children in burned hab blocks, refugees in blown docking bays, one little boy on Europa Station who asked if the dead could breathe if you wrapped them fast enough. The species never mattered in that moment. The look always did. She's not a hostile stray, Daniel said quietly. She's a kid. One of the squad medics, Corporal Imani Reyes, stepped forward a fraction. Lieutenant, I can patch the arm and scan for tags in under 5 minutes. Haynes stared at both of them and understood, too late, that this had stopped being a clean procedural call. And if command says no transport? Daniel straightened to full height. The ruined chamber seemed very still around him. Then command can come say it over her body. That sentence changed the air. Nobody in the squad moved. Nobody needed to. The line had been drawn in the plain old way field lines always are, not between lawful and unlawful, but between what everyone present would later have to remember about themselves. Haynes was not a coward, but he was ambitious, and ambition often loses the first round against direct witness. He swore once under his breath, then keyed the channel again with far more irritation than confidence. Echo 7 requesting emergency humanitarian variance for 1 native juvenile casualty. Potential intelligence value, possible civilian classification. Need med evac authorization and temporary custody status. The reply took too long. When it came, command's boredom was obvious through the static. Variance denied. Mission scope unchanged. If subject cannot be secured without compromising extraction window, terminate or abandon at local discretion. Nobody in the chamber spoke after that. The child would not have understood the words, but she understood tone. Her grip on the anchor stone tightened until fresh blood ran from her palm where the edge bit in. Haynes exhaled sharply. There's your answer. Daniel turned to him with a calmness far more dangerous than anger. No, he said. That's an answer. Then he took off his rifle, handed it to Imani, and crouched down in front of the child. She flinched so hard her shoulder hit the wall, but he kept his hands open and low, the way you approach the injured when your species has spent too long teaching others to fear your shape. Hey, he said softly, knowing she likely understood nothing and everything at once. I'm not leaving you here. The translator patch at his collar, damaged by dust, but still functional enough for broad field dialects, rendered the sentence into hesitant Ilyari. The girl stared. He slowly held out one hand. You hear me? You're coming with us. Her eyes dropped to the hand, then to his face again. The room behind him remained full of armed humans, dead stone, and all the old reasons she should have recoiled. Instead, after a shivering pause that seemed to stretch across much more than those few seconds, she reached forward with blood-slick fingers and touched two of his knuckles, as if testing whether he was real. Then, with the solemn desperation of a child choosing a bridge that may yet collapse, she let go of the anchor stone and placed her whole tiny hand in his. Behind them, Lieutenant Haynes made a sound of disbelief. "Mercer, if you walk out with that alien child, you are putting your career in a furnace." Daniel looked back only once. "Then it can burn," he said. That was the choice. Small in motion, enormous in consequence. By the time they left the ruined shrine city beneath the copper sky, carrying one wounded alien child against orders, none of them yet understood that the act would travel far beyond a single disobedient field rescue. They thought, at most, that Daniel had just ruined his future over one impossible moral impulse in the middle of a dirty war. What they did not know was that the child in his arms bleeding, half-conscious, clutching the front of his armor with all the strength left in her would wake in the evac transport, look up at the only human who had chosen not to let the world finish swallowing her, and say the sentence that would begin changing far more than his career. "You are my anchor forever." Chapter 2. The Child Who Would Not Let Go. The med-evac shuttle smelled of antiseptic foam, hot electronics, and old fear, the universal scent of transport between battlefield and bureaucracy. Daniel sat strapped into the jump seat nearest the gurney because no one could persuade the child to release him long enough for proper restraint. Not even Imani, who had more patience in her hands than most priests had in their whole theology. The moment the medics tried separating her fingers from the front seal of his armor, the little Iori girl had gone from silent shock to absolute terror, thrashing with enough panic to tear open the clotting bandage on her arm. So they had improvised. Pressure mesh on the wound. Sedation missed at the lowest safe threshold. Daniel seated close enough that she could keep one hand curled in his shirt beneath the armor seam while the shuttle clawed upward out of Kepler 9's poisoned dusk. Lieutenant Haynes remained in the forward compartment, making furious after-action reports that sounded increasingly like an obituary for Daniel's career. Daniel barely listened. He had survived too many debriefs to fear paperwork in the old way, and there was something more urgent in front of him than command anger. The tiny alien child who had finally stopped shaking only when his hand closed over hers in return. Her species file, pulled from whatever remained of the colonial databases, identified her as Ilyari, sublineage coastal-born, approximately 7 standard years by maturation markers. No surviving local ID yet. No known next of kin. Likely orphaned during the bombardment of the Western Shrine complexes. The med scan added more practical horrors. Shrapnel laceration. Nutritional depletion. Elevated stress chemistry, so severe the machine flagged it twice. 2 rib fractures healing badly from older trauma. And beneath all that, a neurological storm pattern common in young Ilyari after extreme emotional shock. Erratic anchor response. The child's instinctive and semi-spiritual tendency to bond their sense of safety to one object, place, or person when the world around them became too unstable to hold otherwise. Imani explained that last part while adjusting the scanner patch at the girl's neck. "Their children do it more strongly than ours," she said quietly. "Sometimes with a family relic, sometimes with a caregiver. In disaster it can get intense." Daniel looked down at the little hand still twisted in his shirt. "Meaning?" Imani gave him a tired sideways glance. "Meaning if her nervous system has decided you're the reason she's still alive. She may react very badly if someone tries to separate you before she stabilizes." He almost laughed at that, because what else was there to do? Somewhere behind them command was already deciding whether to strip him of rank for insubordination, and the universe had apparently decided that his reward for following his conscience was an alien child who might now think he belonged to her in some sacred neurological sense. But the laugh never fully came. He looked at her face instead, softened by low sedative and exhaustion, and saw the tracks dust had left where tears had dried. There was nothing absurd in that. Only responsibility. War manufactures enough ruins without adults running from the few bonds formed inside them. They landed at Fort Resolute Medical Annex under blackout conditions and immediate command interest. By then the rescue had already outrun his control. The field squad's helmet recordings were in review. The denied transport request and the command response were in the record. Haynes had submitted his own recommendation for disciplinary inquiry before the shuttle wheels even touched the deck. 2 intelligence officers were waiting outside Triage, along with a civilian affairs specialist and 1 severe woman from the Frontier Ethics Board, whose presence meant the situation had moved from annoying violation into the dangerous territory where institutions fear optics. Daniel should have handed the child over there. That was the proper thing. The system thing. Instead, the med team found, as Amani predicted, that the moment they tried lifting the girl fully away, she woke in blind terror and began clawing at the gurney rails so violently one of the nurses nearly lost a finger trying to calm her. It took 3 medics, 2 failed translator loops, and Daniel kneeling beside the gurney while dust from the ruined shrine still dried on his boots to stop the panic spiral. He leaned down, close enough for her to focus on the shape of one face instead of the swarm beyond it. "Easy," he said, voice low, the same tone he had once used on a wounded child during the Neptune riots and a trapped civilian on Telem Reach when the station was venting in pulses and everyone sounded half dead from cold. "You're safe. No one's taking you anywhere alone." The translator murmured the Ilyari equivalent half a second later. Her eyes found him through the blur of pain and sedation, wide and impossible. She reached with both hands then, one bandaged, one still dirty from the ruin, and clutched his wrist with desperate force. The civilian affairs specialist cleared her throat. "Sergeant Mercer, she cannot remain physically attached to the reporting officer indefinitely. She also can't keep ripping open her arm every time you test that theory." Imani snapped back before Daniel had to. The med chief, a white-haired surgeon who had long ago learned how often regulations are written by people not present for the screaming, made the final call. "Temporary stabilization exception," he said. "She stays in low-stim pediatrics. Mercer may remain until neurochemical response drops below cascade threshold. After that, we reassess." The intelligence officers hated it. That helped. For the next 19 hours, Daniel stayed. He should not have been allowed. He knew that. But war leaves strange flex points in institutions, and enough people who saw the footage from the Shrine City came away unable to push cleanly against the simple human fact that the child trusted exactly one person in the room. So a cot was dragged into pediatric isolation too, and Sergeant Daniel Mercer, decorated infantry NCO, probable future disciplinary case, not at all trained for this, spent the night in a softly lit med ward learning how to sit still enough that a frightened alien child could sleep without waking every 30 minutes to make sure he still existed. Her name, they learned on the second waking. It came in fragments. "Ari," she whispered first, pressing her face into the blanket while the translator struggled with the old Ilyari consonants. Then, after Imani coaxed a little more gently and Daniel held the cup, while she drank water in tiny suspicious sips, "Ariseth." It was a child's formal name, ceremonial in full form, likely shortened in family use. Daniel repeated it badly. She watched him with solemn concentration and corrected the sound by tapping 2 fingers against his knuckles, as if teaching him proper existence required tactile guidance. When he got close enough, the faint blue stress lights at her temples dimmed for the first time since the med team had scanned her. Imani saw that and mouthed a private curse. "That's anchor confirmation," she murmured. "I don't think this is temporary, Dan." He rubbed a hand over his face. "Don't call me Dan when you're telling me things that ruin lives." She didn't smile. Too late for that. Command interviews began the next morning. They rotated through like weather fronts. First, the legal officer asking why he countermanded direct operational guidance in the field. Then the ethics investigator wanting an exact reconstruction of his reasoning, as though conscience might be reverse-engineered into acceptable doctrine if she asked precisely enough. Then Lieutenant Haynes, still stiff with anger and the mortal terror of young officers who think subordinate disobedience is contagious. "You embarrassed the unit, undermined mission authority, and created a species complication custody problem in an active war zone," Haynes said from the foot of the bed, while Ariseth slept with one hand wrapped in Daniel's sleeve. Daniel, too tired by then to make diplomacy worth the effort, answered without looking up. "I kept a kid from bleeding out in a ruin because command was too afraid of paperwork to call her what she was." Haynes colored. She is the offspring of a hostile population dash. She is 7, Daniel cut in. The room stayed still after that, because no one in it, not even Haynes, had the stomach to say the next words aloud. By evening, the story had begun leaking beyond the base. Field rescue footage always does, especially when it contains enough contradiction to make every faction hungry. Human soldier defies orders to save alien child. Ilyari minor bonds to Terran NCO after Western Shrine operation. Command split over treatment of civilian enemy young. Outrage came quickly from all directions, each kind sincere in its own poison. Some demanded Daniel's immediate arrest for endangering troops and compromising deterrence. Others argued the military had just proven its own moral rot by ever considering abandonment of a child. Anti-Yari voices called Ari Seth a future insurgent symbol and accused Daniel of sentimental treason. Humanitarian networks elevated the rescue into proof that field units could still resist the logic of total war. The base sealed its official channels tighter. That only fed the fire. Ari Seth knew none of this directly. What she knew was pain, a new room, bright air too dry for her lungs, strange food she distrusted, and one tired human soldier who always came back through the door no matter how many uniforms tried taking him away for just 10 minutes. She tracked him with painful seriousness, as if each departure reopened the possibility of the whole universe collapsing again. On the third day, she woke from a nightmare in a full-body tremor and latched onto his forearm so fiercely Imani had to pry her nails loose to check his circulation afterward. Once calm returned, Ari Seth rested her forehead against his hand and said the words again in halting trade standard, more clearly this time, as if making a formal declaration. "You are my anchor forever." The translator rendered it too smoothly. The original Ilyari phrasing carried deeper weight, something between guardian, home marker, and the fixed point by which one remembers oneself against the storm. Imani explained it with the grave awe of someone who understands the biological and spiritual implications better than Daniel wanted to. "This isn't a child saying she likes you," she said. "In her people's oldest understanding, an anchor is what keeps the soul from drifting after catastrophe. She's bound her recovery to you." Daniel stared at her. "That's insane." Imani shrugged. "Welcome to war medicine." What no one in that room yet fully grasped was that the phrase would not remain between them. It would leave the med ward, travel through military leaks, humanitarian channels, Ilyari survivor networks, and eventually across half the scarred systems that had watched Kepra 9 burn. Some would call it evidence of dangerous alien imprinting. Others would call it sacred. The Ilyari survivors who heard it through refugee relay would react with something close to collective shock, because in their old culture anchor bonds were not poetic accidents. They were obligations. Lifelong if honored. Spirit-breaking if betrayed. And now one had been spoken by the orphan child of a shattered people to a human soldier under military review. The universe, already strained by the war, would find very soon that it did not know what to do with that. Neither did Daniel Mercer. He only knew that every time he considered the practical solution, transfer, separation, reassignment, anything to restore his life to recognizable military shape, Haraseth looked at him with those dimly glowing storm eyes and held on harder, and something in him that war had not yet managed to kill refused to become the next thing that abandoned her. That refusal would cost him almost everything he had before. It would also make him the center of something far larger than one rescue. Chapter 3. A bond the war couldn't explain away. The summons to High Colonial Command came on the 5th day, wrapped in the cold language institutions use when they are trying to make a moral crisis sound like a file discrepancy. Sergeant Daniel Mercer was to present himself for extraordinary conduct review regarding operational disobedience, custody irregularity, and potential strategic compromise arising from unauthorized retention of an enemy civilian minor in military medical space. He read it standing beside Araseth's bed while she carefully assembled pieces of soft ration bread into little stacked towers on the tray, as if the universe might remain stable if architecture was respected. When he finished, he folded the slate once and set it face down. She looked up immediately. Children who survive war become experts at reading the gravity around adults long before they understand the language. "You go?" she asked. "For a little while." "No." He almost smiled despite everything. "That's not really how military orders work." Her expression hardened with tiny, heartbreaking intensity. "No," she repeated, and this time the translator made it sound less like refusal and more like law. He should have prepared for separation then. Any sensible officer would have. But the days had taught him a dangerous habit. Every time the institution moved to solve the problem Ari Seth represented, the people involved first had to meet her, and once they met her, certainty began leaking from their posture. It happened to med staff. It happened to legal personnel. It even happened to one gray-faced intelligence analyst who entered the room convinced she was evaluating a possible insurgent symbol and left 20 minutes later after awkwardly tucking a blanket edge around the little girl's feet because the wind control in the ward had made her shiver. A real child is much harder to use as an abstraction than the political classes prefer. Daniel was counting, perhaps unfairly, on that human weakness. He was only half right. High Colonial Command did not ask him to surrender Ariseth first. It asked him to explain himself, publicly and in detail, before a review board that had already decided the matter could not remain a private disciplinary event. Too many leaks. Too much public argument. Too many humanitarian agencies, veteran groups, and refugee observers watching. The hearing chamber on Mars was packed with military brass, colonial administrators, intelligence lawyers, civilian oversight reps, and enough recording nodes to turn every facial twitch into debate fuel across the system by nightfall. Daniel hated all of them on sight. Not because they were wrong individually, some perhaps were trying to be decent, but because their collective presence meant one child's life had already become a theater. The questioning started brutally. Did he understand that field discretion under wartime statutes did not extend to unsanctioned guardian assumption? Yes. Did he understand the possibility that Ari Seth, as a surviving member of the native population in an active insurgency theater, might be of intelligence interest beyond humanitarian classification? Yes. Did he understand that by centering himself in her stabilization, he had potentially compromised later neutral transfer? Yes. Then why had he done it? The legal director who asked that last question expected a polished defense moral philosophy, perhaps, or tactical necessity phrased in a way that preserved the machine's face. Daniel, who by then had slept 6 disjointed hours in 3 days, answered with the flat force of a man too tired to decorate truth for authority. "Because you told us to leave a wounded child in a bombed ruin if carrying her out inconvenienced the extraction window," he said. "Because the order that came back treated a 7-year-old girl like contaminated equipment. Because I've spent enough years in war to know when we've started lying to ourselves in the official voice." The chamber did not enjoy that. One admiral actually bristled. "This hearing is not about your personal revulsion toward necessary wartime tree-off." Daniel turned his head and looked at him hard enough that the older man's anger faltered a fraction. "No, sir," Daniel said. "It's about whether you want that sentence attached to her face permanently in the public record." That was the first moment Command truly realized the story was getting away from them. It was not just that Daniel had rescued Ariseth. It was that the rescue had collided with too many other buried tensions from the war. Human troops were tired of being used to carry out policies drafted by people insulated from the visible consequences. Civilian publics had seen too many enemy children in camp footage to keep pretending total moral categories remained stable. Refugee advocates were already circulating witness reports from surviving Ilyari civilians describing similar discretionary abandonment under field command pressure. Most explosively, the Ilyari themselves had begun responding through every surviving relay, and their response centered not on accusation but on the Anchorbond Declaration. To human viewers it sounded poetic. To the Ilyari diaspora, it was seismic. Their elders, scattered now across camps, station enclaves, hidden cave habitats, and the charity margins of worlds too far to care deeply, began sending statements in old ceremonial language and plain trade. An anchor bond spoken by a child under catastrophe, especially to one outside the kin line, was not an emotional whim. It was a recognized vow state. In ancient Iori law, it created mutual duties. The child's life, guidance, and healing were tied to the anchor. The anchor's choices toward the child shaped not only family obligation but communal legitimacy. Most modern Ilyari had treated the old bond law more as cultural inheritance than active civic reality until the wars smashed enough of their institutions that inherited things became load-bearing again. Now their scholars, healers, and surviving magistrates were telling the galaxy that if humanity tore Ariseth from the person she had named, it would not merely be separating a frightened child from a rescuer. It would be committing a spiritual mutilation under the survivor's oldest surviving covenant. The human state found itself suddenly confronting something it disliked very much. A clear moral framework not its own, articulated coherently, witnessed publicly, and attached to a child it had already nearly abandoned. The board recessed in visible discomfort. That should have helped. Instead, it made the next move more dangerous. Because whenever institutions pause without resolution under public pressure, rival factions rush in to settle the matter by uglier means. The first attempt was legal. Military intelligence petitioned emergency transfer of Ariseth to deep civilian protection off-world, arguing that Daniel's continuing presence endangered her by keeping the case politically inflamed. The second attempt was quieter. An unsigned order slid into ward administration at 217 local, authorizing sedation, neurochemical dampening, and relocation prior to any further public hearing. It would have gone through too. That was the worst part. Not because the staff were monsters, but because on a base drowning in directives, unsigned cruelty can look uncomfortably similar to standard urgency if delivered with the right code formatting. The only reason it failed was that Imani Reyes, still running med shifts in the pediatric unit, recognized the dosage package as wrong for child trauma stabilization and triggered a verification delay. By the time the delay exposed the forgery, the ward corridor was already filling with security, 3 rival command authorizations, and Daniel Mercer in a state that one witness later described as the calm right before a man is prepared to commit a felony for the correct reason. He found Ariseth awake in the dark, monitors dimmed to sleep settings, small hands gripping the rails because she had sensed before anyone told her that adults were about to do something irreversible in voices too controlled to trust. "You go," she whispered. There it was again, the whole universe reduced to the oldest fear. He crouched beside the bed and, for perhaps the first time since the Shrine City, let his own exhaustion show plainly. "Not without you," he said. Security entered 30 seconds later. The standoff that followed should have destroyed him. Orders barked. Sidearms drawn but low. Medical staff shouting about patient condition. 2 command seals contradicting one another in real time. Ariseth starting to panic hard enough that the blue stress lights in her temples flared bright as emergency lamps. Daniel did not reach for his weapon. He stood between the bed and the door and said, with terrible clarity, "Anyone who takes her tonight will have to write exactly why in front of every camera already watching." That was the genius and curse of the whole scandal by then. Too many people were watching. The corridor feeds were being mirrored automatically after the first hearing. Veteran groups, refugee networks, and half the Iliari diaspora would see the footage before morning if force was used. The officers at the door knew it. So they hesitated. Just long enough for the political weather beyond the base to change again. Because someone in the capital had finally understood the scale of the risk. At 3:01 a.m. presidential hold order froze all transfers, custody changes, and medical interventions relating to Ariseth pending direct executive review. It landed not as mercy, but as shock containment. The state, suddenly aware it might be one corridor fight away from filming itself ripping a war orphan from the man she had publicly bound as anchor, chose delay over irrevocable disgrace. The order saved everyone in that hallway from themselves. It also ensured the matter could no longer be quietly solved. 3 days later, the review reopened under full public oversight and new evidence. This time, the board did not hear only Daniel, command, and med staff. It heard Iliari elder witnesses transmitted from refuge stations. It heard trauma specialists. It heard legal historians on bond recognition cultures in wartime. It heard from human soldiers who admitted, in painful numbers, that the rescue footage had hit them harder than a dozen campaign speeches because they were tired of acting as if enemy children somehow ceased being children at the edge of a kill zone. And then, in a decision that would have been unthinkable even a week earlier, it heard from Ariseth herself. Not a polished statement. She was too young, too hurt, too uncertain in the shared language. But she sat in a small chair beside the witness rail with a toy construction set in her lap and Daniel's hand inside both of hers and answered the essential questions in the only vocabulary that mattered. Did she understand who Sergeant Mercer was? Anchor. Did she wish to be moved away from him? No. Why? A long pause then. Because some truths are too big for children, but children still carry them whole. Storm took all, she said finally. He did not. No lawyer in the chamber recovered quickly from that. The ruling came 2 days later and shocked everyone for different reasons. Daniel Mercer was formally censured for disobedience under combat extraction order. The censure was suspended. Ari Seth was classified not as detainee, not as intelligence ward, but as protected war orphan under extraordinary cultural accommodation. The Ilyari anchor bond was granted provisional recognition under interspecies emergency covenant. Daniel was not ordered to adopt her states remain allergic to admitting the heart has outrun their categories, but he was appointed her legal protective custodian pending longer-term integration review. In practice, the galaxy saw the truth immediately. The human soldier who had saved the alien child in defiance of orders had just been told, by the same civilization that nearly left her to die, that he now belonged to her future in law as much as in feeling. The universe did not know what to call that. Some called it dangerous softness. Some called it sacred law. Many simply called it impossible. What no one yet understood was that this decision would not end the conflict around them. It would begin a larger one. Because there were still people human and alien both who could tolerate many things, but not the idea that a child's bond and one soldier's conscience might redraw the moral map after a war. And those people were already moving. Chapter 4. You Are My Anchor Forever. The attempt to take Ari Seth by force ended not with gunfire, but with law, public fury, and one little girl stepping into history with a child's clarity that made entire ministries look morally illiterate by comparison. After the board's ruling, Earth tried very hard to turn the matter back into procedure. That is what governments do when conscience has embarrassed them into a better choice than they wanted. There were integration plans, oversight committees, psychological evaluations, interspecies guardianship reviews, cultural liaison councils, and all the tidy machinery by which a state tries to reassure itself that the extraordinary has now been domesticated into acceptable process. Daniel Mercer was reassigned from active infantry to protected civil military status, while his custodial role was assessed. Imani Reyes found herself suddenly promoted into a pediatric cultural care unit because no one trusted outsiders to understand the case better. Ari Seth was moved not far, never far to a low-gravity rehabilitation residence outside New Geneva where Ilyari survivors, child specialists, and legal observers could all participate in whatever the universe had decided to call this strange new family shape forming there. To the public, it looked almost like resolution. It was not. The war on Kepra 9 had left too much poison in too many systems for one merciful ruling to dissolve it. Veterans' grievance blocks saw the bond recognition as insult piled atop unresolved loss. Sarithi and other alien survivors read the case as proof that human law was capable of conscience only when publicly cornered. Frontier hawks feared the precedent of integrating enemy cultural obligations into military justice. Corporate sectors with interests in border conflict loathed the emotional contagion of the whole affair, because stories where one soldier's refusal to obey reshapes policy are bad for any industry that thrives on clean obedience and dirty deniability. Worse, much worse, the case had gone interstellar. Minor species from war zones everywhere were now citing the Mercer-Seth ruling when arguing for child protections, civilian corridor exemptions, and cultural autonomy in post-conflict handling. One choice in a Martian execution yard had begun to loosen other gears across the galaxy that made enemies faster than compassion alone ever could. The second major attempt to erase the problem came through politics. A bloc in the Senate pushed emergency review of the provisional bond recognition, framing it as a dangerous emotional overreach forced by wartime optics. They did not say outright that Ari Seth should be removed from Daniel now that the cameras had cooled. They said the state should avoid cementing unstable trauma attachments across adversarial species lines. The phrasing was almost impressive in its cruelty. Behind it stood all the usual interest security purists, vengeance factions, and those rare bureaucratic souls who will tolerate any human suffering so long as the policy language remains sophisticated. The review might even have succeeded if it had stayed inside committee walls. But by then Ari Seth was no longer a faceless policy complication. She had become visible. The interview was never supposed to air live. It began as a controlled public reassurance segment arranged by the Reconstruction Network to soften the heated discourse around interspecies adoption, war trauma, and the state's revised custodial standards. The producers expected Daniel to give careful, soldierly answers, perhaps Imani to speak about child recovery, and one polished Ilyari elder to explain the cultural context in terms sufficiently mystical that viewers could feel respectful without being deeply challenged. What they did not expect was that Ari Seth herself, now stronger, thinner still but no longer half ghost, would insist on sitting beside Daniel during the recording and then decide she had her own opinion about the entire question of whether anyone should be allowed to take her away. She sat on the edge of the studio couch in a blue-gray child wrap tailored to account for Ilyari's skin sensitivity, one hand resting automatically on Daniel's sleeve as if the contact were as ordinary as gravity. Her hair had grown longer, dark white around her shoulders now, and the old stormlights at her temples no longer flared except under stress. When the host, a well-meaning fool, asked whether she understood that many people were still debating where she properly belonged, Ari Seth frowned with the uncompromising offense unique to children who have already outlived too much nonsense. "I belong where my anchor is," she said. The host smiled in that strained adult way people do when they think they can gently redirect a child away from inconvenient truth. "Some say Sergeant Mercer cannot be your anchor forever, that eventually you may need to return to your own people." Daniel visibly tensed, ready to intercept. Ari Seth beat him to it. "I am my people," she said. The studio went silent. She looked then not at the host, but directly into the nearest camera, and every later political disaster grew from what followed. Her trade standard was still imperfect, but the flaw only gave the words more force because no one could mistake them for rehearsed rhetoric. "Humans say war takes homes," she said slowly. "That is true. War took mine. He did not. If you take me from him now, you make same storm again, but wearing law clothes." Then she leaned closer to Daniel, slipped both arms around one of his, and delivered the line that would race through half the known systems before dawn. "You are my anchor forever." By morning, the review bill was dead. Not because politicians suddenly grew souls. Because too many people had seen the clip, replayed it, cried over it, fought over it, and recognized with embarrassing clarity what the state would look like if it proceeded anyway. There are acts of cruelty that remain stable when abstract and collapse the instant one child says them back to the world in plain language. This was one of those. Veterans split more openly after that, many still angry, some unable to remain angry in the same way after hearing Ari Seth speak. Ilyari survivors transmitted formal adoption and kinship blessings through old right channels, some of them directed not just to Daniel, but to the human house that chose not to abandon. Human families from other war zones rode in by the tens of thousands, not all supportive in politics, but unable to deny the simple power of a child insisting that law without tenderness is merely violence with better posture. The galaxy reacted in ways Earth had not planned for. 3 border compacts rewrote their post-conflict child transfer statutes within a year using language drawn explicitly from the Mercer precedent. A dozen military academies began teaching the Mars interruption case as an ethics failure turned partial recovery event. Humanitarian coalitions used it as leverage in negotiations where governments tried to sever young survivors from local bonds under the excuse of processing simplicity. Even old enemy states, those who had every reason to hate the moral example, found themselves forced to respond because their own orphan and prisoner policies suddenly looked more monstrous by comparison. Daniel Mercer, who had wanted only to keep one child from dying in a ruin and perhaps salvage enough of himself to sleep afterward, became a symbol whether he liked it or not. He handled it badly, which made many trust him more. He was uncomfortable on speaking circuits, openly hostile to people who tried turning Ari Seth into inspirational decoration, and once walked out of a diplomatic gala after a minister introduced him as proof that our legal institutions remain fundamentally sound. But he stayed when it mattered. Through night terrors, through culture lessons, through language tutoring, through the first time Ari Seth visited an Ilyari memory garden and shook so badly afterward that he carried her home, though she insisted she was too old for carrying. Through the furious adolescent years that arrived later with all the predictable sparks of someone both human-shaped by bond and alien in every blood-deep instinct. Through the annual memorial days when his own dead and hers seemed to crowd the house until silence itself felt overfull. Forever, he learned, is not a poetic word when spoken by the traumatized. It is labor. He chose it anyway. Years later, when Ari Seth was old enough to stand before the Interstellar Child Protection Charter Assembly as one of its youngest advocates, scholars still argued about what exactly had shocked the universe most. Some said it was the execution halt itself, the rare sight of a soldier disobeying in public for conscience and surviving with his moral argument intact. Others said it was the legal revolution that followed, the way one alien child's bond forced great powers to admit that post-war justice had been using bloodline and convenience too freely. The sentimental preferred the answer of love, because universes like romance when history has been too ugly for too long. But Ari Seth herself, asked this once by a historian at New Geneva, gave the truest response. The universe was not shocked that he saved me, she said. People save children every day and still call it surprising because they are ashamed it feels rare. The shock was that after he chose me, he kept choosing me when it became difficult. That is what made the bond real. Not the rescue, not the phrase, not the public tears or the law reforms or the scandalized songs written by worlds who had never met them. It was the repetition, the daily stubbornness, the refusal to reduce one extraordinary act into a legend and then walk away from its consequences. She had been meant to die by humans. One man's choice had interrupted that machinery. But the universe was truly changed not because he pulled her from a ruin or stopped a firing line. It was changed because when she said, "You are my anchor forever," he answered not with poetry, but with a life shaped around being worthy of the words.